The Rundown, Part 21, a Farlost story by John Miro.
Twilight fell upon the darkening road. I found myself again alone. Street lights went out by one, by two, by three. Now reveled in the shadows that had grown. Yes, I reveled in the darkness I had known.
Two exoskeleton-enhanced humans were closing in behind Tyzan, and two more behind Nic, with a Skanen thrown in for good measure. In just a few seconds, this would turn into a firefight. Tyzan threw a punch, continuing their ruse. A much slower punch than he could have, Nic was sure, but it was still frighteningly hard to deke out of the way and wrap his jacket around the bigger man's wrist. He managed the trick and spun him. Tyzan let him and added his own momentum, and Nic whipped his wrist free, putting the extra spin generated into a kick into the unprotected face of one of the exoed thugs just 2 steps away now. Nic heard a deep bass rumble of Skanen surprise from behind him, but kept his focus on the closest thug, already reaching his arms. They came faster than human musculature could account for, and he felt one begin to close around his neck. A fraction of a second away from having his spine shattered, Nic had his pistol in hand and fired a solid round through the reaching arm. He gagged as the arm froze, only half closed around his neck before it was severed from control. People screamed on the street. Still falling from his first kick, he shot the thug twice more, center mass, ending his life. He fell hard. Eyes watering, still choking, Nic centered his pistol on Tyzan and his 3 attackers. The Skanen was already out of the fight, mandibles clacking, black ichor dripping out of its mouth, and 2 new holes in its head. 2 of its eye stalks lay on the road, each a meter away from their former owner. Something rammed the back of his vest, sending Nic tumbling a few feet. He'd been shot. His assault vest had done its job, distributing the force of the blow around its entire surface, saving his life. Nic felt the vest's stiff collar extending up his neck, lengthening and spreading into a transparent mask over his face and the back of his skull. His face was covered before he turned back to the fight. Another round exploded a few millimeters from his left cheekbone, and a moment later his face was uncovered again. Shards of the face shield dug into his neck and shoulders. He stumbled backwards over the 2 hitters he'd dropped, but rammed his shoulder against the wall to stay on his feet and return fire. Nic's shot sparked and pinged as it bounced off an armored neck, but the velocity of the round sent the exo-enhanced form spinning to the ground, stunned. He took aim on the last threat and swore. Tyzan was in the way. He struggled to his feet, tugging off the half-closed arm still hanging from his neck as he ran into the fray. He spied the 2 schoolgirls across the road in the shelter of a doorway. One was shrieking through the other's hand clamped over her mouth. "Stay down," he shouted to them and put his eyes back on Tyzan. The guard officer's foe was almost his size and armored to boot. Nic saw his hands were empty, but the lack of a weapon wasn't much comfort when exoed fingers could crush bones like paper. Nic ran toward them. "Get down on your knee!" Halfway through his command, the other thug appeared in the air above Tyzan and his opponent. Nic slid to the ground, fingers toggling the payload control on the side of his pistol as he skidded forward. He fired up into the air just before the big man reached him. The explosive round bounced off the exoskeleton, same as the slug had. Nic was hammered back to the ground by the small portion of the blast that blew back on him. The other flew through the air, tumbling into the middle of the road. This time his still smoking form lay where it landed, eyes closed. Nic rolled on the ground, blinking away black spots in his vision. His gun hand was numb. He looked down and saw it was in one piece, but he'd lost his gun. He staggered to his feet, leaning against the building and gasping. The road was clear now, except for the 2 schoolgirls huddled together across the road. He drew a shuddering breath and pushed off the wall, shaking his head clear. Tyzan's right shoulder was bloody now, that arm hanging limp. His opponent was circling and smiling. Nic screamed to throw off the attack he saw coming, but the exoed thug ignored him and ran at Tyzan, fingers of both hands spread wide. Before Nic crossed half the distance to the fight, the exo was on top of Tyzan. Tyzan's supposedly limp right hand came up, deflecting clawing fingers, and the thug's jaw fell in surprise. He'd committed his momentum, though, and Tyzan's trick had worked. Thinking he'd taken the guard officer's right side out of commission, he'd focused his attack on Tyzan's left and left his other flank exposed. Tyzan snuck under the Exo's left hand, flipping his opponent over his body. Tyzan brought his left hand up and redirected the Exo mid-air to land with all his weight on one leg. Nic could hear the groan of metal as the leg buckled. The man screamed and fell to the ground, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Nic changed direction and leapt over Tyzan, still down on one knee from the phenomenal force of his throw, and delivered a back fist of his own with his left to the face of the screaming man, who went silent and collapsed face first onto the road with a clang. Panting, Nic fell forward, catching himself with his still numb right hand. Tyzan's barrel chest was heaving too. His eyes scanned across the road. Nic looked where Tyzan looked and saw the thug he'd shot push his hands up, shaking his head in the middle of the road. "Stay where you are," Tyzan shouted at the girls across the road and staggered to his feet, crossing to stand between them and the remaining threat. Nic heard the last man chuckle, saw him spit blood onto the ground. "Gonna make you meat, Tyzan." Nic narrowed his eyes at the confirmation. Their attackers definitely knew who and what Tyzan was. "Gonna make dog food out of a guard dog." Tyzan edged away from the girls, drawing the threat away with him. "Come try." The last Exo looked back to Nic and spat another mouthful of blood, then froze, looking down at the ground between them. Nic followed the gaze and saw his service pistol. The thug raced for the gun. Nic grinned and put his hand on his holster, turning a button and sliding it down. It clicked into a new position and the holster vibrated. He scuttled back away from the gun and the thug, pressing himself up against the building. Behind the thug, he watched Tyzan act in the last few seconds before a gun would be in the thug's hands. The guard officer ran back to the schoolgirls, pulling them out of the doorway they'd hidden in when the fight started. He braced himself in the doorway and kicked at the door. It splintered. Another powerful kick and it slammed open. Tyzan tossed the girls inside, shouting at them to run. Nic knew, and he was certain Tyzan knew, he'd never find cover when he made his choice, a cop's choice, to put the lives of trapped civilians first. As time inched forward in freeze frames, Nic watched Tyzan back away from the doorway the girls had fled through and shout at the thug, drawing his attention. The exosuited killer picked up the gun at a lope, continuing forward to kick Nic hard in the ribs before spinning and raising the police service pistol. Nic's lungs were frozen. He couldn't breathe. All he could do was gasp in pain, sagging to the ground. "Bye-bye, doggy," the man snarled and pulled the trigger. Nic's gun emitted a high-pitched whine and exploded, taking the top half of the would-be cop killer with it. Police response was slow to come, even for Peartown. At first, Nic thought that was because he called in the shooting anonymously on his slate. Then he read the news scroll about the attack on the Haven delegation. He cuffed the Exos and used the steel tips of his shoes to ensure they wouldn't be getting up anytime soon. Tyzan collected their attackers' weapons and piled them all, save one pistol for himself and one for Nic, on the ground between them. Nic accepted the weapon and faced the opposite way from Tyzan. Back to back, both men held their pistols at their sides and waited for what rolled down the road next. Nic felt better having Tyzan watching his back, and he pulled up a news feed on his slate to learn more about the Haven bombing. He parsed that thought again. Yeah, it did make him feel better. He trusted Tyzan to have his back. When did that happen? He wondered with a chuckle. He couldn't find much about the bombing, just a reporter citing a police source and claiming the top Haven official was dead. The next thing to roll in were two police carriers, sirens wailing and headlights blinding in the now full-on dark. They landed at either end of the block, and two officers emerged, weapons drawn from each. Nic gasped with relief when he flashed his police holo in the air and the approaching officers lowered their weapons. "Perimeter check," he shouted hoarsely, and they immediately spread out. Then Nic sank to the curb, trying to remember how to breathe and think. He sat there, dazed, until one of the uniforms responding to the call, a young, red-haired human officer, pushed a stun wand into Tyzan's neck roughly disarmed him and tugged his arms behind his back. "Get the hell off him!" Nic roared, back on his feet before the spray cuffs finished hardening around Tyzan's wrists. The young officer turned, face ugly, until he saw Nic's face was uglier. "Melt those cuffs off before I give you a faceful." The young cop, his tag read Roberg, pointed the stun wand down at Tyzan, who, remarkably, was still conscious. "But sir, he was armed," the kid hissed, "and he's a guard." "He's a cop!" Nic got right into the kid's face and spat the words. "Treat him like it." He stood over Roberg and watched as the kid's trembling hands sprayed deactivator over the concrete hard foam binding Tyzan's wrists, then pushed him away and lifted Tyzan back up himself. "Anything broken?" Tyzan shook his head. "Just my pride, getting tagged by a preschooler." Roberg's face was transitioning from white to red. A Skanen with the Locklaw PD insignia laser-cut into the chitin of his shoulders walked over, rumbling with laughter. "Not as sorry as Roberg will be, I'll see to that." The young cop's face turned almost as red as his short-cropped hair, but he kept his tongue this time. Nic recognized the older officer. He flicked his eyes to the rank burned into the chest of his carapace. "Sergeant Farley, right?" Farley had been on the job since before Nic learned to solo pilot Willer. They'd worked on a few smuggling and protection racket cases. Going back further than that, Farley had helped keep his dad and other union spokesmen in one piece, back when the unions and the fledgling Locklaw City Council were butting heads after the end of the war. "That's me, Inspector," the older Skanen said with a warm tone of recognition. He turned to Roberg. "Go help Jack and Bello set a perimeter, Danny." The kid opened his mouth to say something smart and recover some of his pride, Nic was sure, but Farley pinched the collar of his dress shirt and tugged him backwards, none too gently, until he went. Farley chuckled deep in his chest and turned back to Nic. "Sorry for Roberg. He's a good kid, just needs seasoning." Farley turned to Tyzan. "Couple of girls found me and said you got between them and a shooter." Farley's mandibles clacked, and Nic could see him having trouble getting the words out, but he finally managed it. "This is my beat. I know those girls, so thanks." Jaw clenched tight and clearly uncomfortable either with Farley's gratitude or the Skanen's underlying problem giving it to a guard officer, Tyzan just nodded. Nic saved them both. "Someone fragged the Haven General, Tarquis." Farley nodded his massive head. "Captain Yates went down with them. The system guard consul survived, of course. Cockroaches," Farley muttered under his breath. "Yates?" Nic repeated. "Good man, by gods," Farley agreed. "Think this crew had anything to do with that?" Nic stared at the bodies, too alive for questioning. That was good. He peered at Tyzan as he answered Farley. "They knew he was guard. Must have been trailing us. Maybe from the hospital." He said the words, went through the motions, but his head was reeling. Pesh, dead. Yates, dead. Tyzan targeted. "Don't call us in," he blurted, making the decision even as he formed the words. "Let the others know right now." Code 19. Farley's mandibles opened in shock, the human equivalent of a double eyebrow raise, but he turned without a word and fell into a four-legged lope to ensure none of the other officers reported Nic and Tyzan's presence. "Is this you listening to your gut, Inspector?" Tyzan murmured. Nic nodded, starting towards the officers gathering around Farley. He tugged his slate from his pocket and dropped it on the ground. "Both times I've been shot at, only the PD knew where I was going." He crushed the slate under his heel. "How did you find me?" Tyzan stared, processing. "Whoever freed Roland Bird and wants you dead." "Wants us dead?" Nic interrupted. "They knew your name too, remember?" "Has infiltrated your police department," Tyzan finished. Farley was pulling an evidence box from a compartment on his carrier when Nic and Tyzan reached him. The Skanen dropped the box on the ground, popped the top, and stood back. "Anything you want to stick in this evidence box, officers? It's fully shielded from scanning and detection systems to protect against evidence tampering, ensure chain of custody, all that good stuff. I hope I don't forget to book this into evidence and just leave this slotted in my car," Farley boomed good-naturedly. "I am getting terribly forgetful." "Thanks for this, Sarge," Nic said. He tossed his jacket in, shrugged painfully out of his tactical vest and threw that in too. His wallet, badge, holster, and gun followed. Roberg was back, his face ugly and his back stiff. He ignored Nic and Tyzan and whispered something to his partner. Farley's mandibles scissored together, a harsh scraping sound, and Roberg shut up. "Get your civvies out of the back, Danny. See if one of the others has anything that will fit the big guy, too." Roberg's face screwed up, but Farley laid one arm on his shoulder. "You don't have to trust them, Danny. Trust me. This is one of those times for coloring outside the lines." It took a second for Danny to decide, but the tension in his back let up and he nodded at his partner and at Nic and Tyzan, then walked around the carrier. "Seasoning," Farley murmured quietly to himself. Then he clapped both upper sets of arms together. "Is that everything?" Nic tossed in his boots, tugged his shirt and pants and boxers off, and threw them in too. Lastly, he took a deep breath and removed his necklace. He snapped off the cylindrical vial attached to it and tossed the chain on top of his clothes. "Got a scan-proof bag, Sarge?" "What the hell?" Roberg asked, coming around the car with an armful of clothes, just as Nic was folding the bag closed around his vial. Nic made an impatient hurry-up gesture with his hands and started dressing in Danny's off-duty clothes. "Your turn," Nic said to Tyzan. "Anything anyone can use to scan you goes in the box." "This will get us to Bird?" Tyzan asked, stripping quickly. "This Code 19? "This might keep us alive long enough to catch Bird," Nic said. Farley gave a teasing wolf whistle, and Danny scowled as Tyzan shrugged into a shirt that stretched almost to breaking over his wide chest. Once the guard officer's clothes followed Nic's into the box, Tyzan turned to Farley. "Have you a multi-tool? Pliers?" Roberg's hand opened a pouch on his belt and removed a folded silver tool. He tossed it wordlessly at Tyzan. There were more sirens in the distance as Tyzan unfolded the tool. Nic swore under his breath. "Whatever you're going to do, make it fast, huh?" Tyzan stared at Nic, then opened his mouth and inserted the open pair of pliers. Nic winced when he heard the crack. Danny's complexion did an about-face from red back to white when Tyzan tugged, and when he yanked once, twice, and pulled out a tooth with the third pull, Farley laughed a loud, booming laugh. "Let's go," Nic said, pulling Tyzan toward the end of the block as soon as his tooth was in the box and Danny was staring at the bloody tool he had back in his hands. Sergeant Farley kicked the box closed, and the light flashed green. Danny heard the lock whine as it engaged, but his eyes were on the two dark forms disappearing around the corner. "Get this stowed," Farley called, and Danny turned just in time to catch the box his partner was pushing at him. "Here's what you say. We showed up to the scene of an anonymous report. We found 5 lowlifes, 2 still breathing, no one else. Nothing else. You clear?" Danny yanked the box out of Farley's hands. "I get it, for Thorn's sake, but this is tampering, obstruction. Why are we putting our jobs on the line even for Super Cop Usher? And what the hell's Code 19? "We're doing it because you trust me, and I trust him," Farley said. He looked past Danny's shoulder as he answered, to the place Nicodemus and his new partner had slipped away. "Put your trust in the law once your ass is sitting in a nice, shiny courtroom, Danny." His insectoid face shuddered into a Skanen smile, and Farley headed across the block to make sure Chak and Bello had their stories straight. "But out here, there isn't any judge to make the bad guys play nice." "Fine, I trust you, but there's no Code 19 in the regs," Danny grumbled after him. "What's it mean, Sarge?" Farley's voice was serious and worried when he answered. "It means they're not coming back until the job is done." You have been listening to The Rundown, a Farlost story, written by John Miro. Learn more at servingworlds.com. Opening music, Everything Is Not What It Appears, kindly provided by Nate Maingard at natemaingard.com. Closing music, Full On by Kevin MacLeod of Incompetech.com. If you like what you hear, you can become a patron and support more stories at patreon.com/servingworlds. Thanks for listening. See you next week.